Germany of Siegfried, of mythical heroes and the barbaric splendor of all that goes with war, but the foretaste of defeat. Was this myth that Hitler had given his people all that they now had left to back their pledge to him in return? My Führer, the West Wall stands and will hold, come what may. The 58th volume of the United States Army's History of World War II is entitled The Siegfried Line Campaign by Charles B. MacDonald. It covers the fierce fighting along the German frontier near the city of Aachen in the fall and early winter of the year 1944. This volume was prepared by the Office of the Chief of Military History as a part of the most comprehensive historical program ever attempted by any nation. It will provide the American people with a full report of the U.S. Army's role in World War II and a permanent record of the accomplishments of the men who fought its battles. In his preface, the author says, "This period may eventually be regarded as one of the most instructive of the entire war in Europe. A company, a battalion, or regiment fighting alone and often unaided was more the rule than the exception. In nuclear war, or in so-called limited war in underdeveloped areas, of which we hear so much today, this may well be the form the fighting will assume. It has been said that those who ignore their history are condemned to repeat it. The story of the Siegfried Line campaign takes place in northern Germany. It is the story of savage combat by small units against a tenacious enemy, formidable defenses, inhospitable terrain, supply problems, and weather as hostile as any enemy threat. There was no mistaking that frontier. Like those legendary dragon's teeth that sprang from the earth as armed men, its anti-tank obstacles stretched in a ribbon of mute sentries uncoiled across the quiet countryside. Built in the late 30s, the myth of the Third Reich was built into those dragon's teeth, drawing the face of Germany in a grimace of defiant scorn for a world at peace. Now the years of war were passing elsewhere, and the neglected line, with its empty fortifications, was becoming part of a landscape where earth and myth merged into one, as that summer now merged into fall. And with fall, the Allied threat came at last, its armies sweeping the enemy before them across Europe like leaves are swept before a vengeful wind. But confidence, not vengeance, was what lit the faces in General Courtney Hodges' First Army. What was a myth to men who had landed at Normandy on D-Day, made the break from the beachhead, and liberated Paris? After moving at unprecedented speeds, all three corps of the First Army readied to thrust into Germany, assured that even the frontier would scarcely check the enemy's retreat before them. It was the 7th Corps, under General J. Lawton Collins, that would set the First Army's pace and make the main effort. In order to breach the Siegfried Line's fortifications before the Germans had a chance to man them, Collins mounted a reconnaissance in force the day after the first patrols had penetrated the frontier. To the north, with only their own tanks to cover them, they attacked across open field, where every step forward was a gamble, over roads alive with mines and villages alive with snipers. Fences and backyards were the only shelter, and too often, no shelter at all. Within 5 days, the 7th Corps had seized the high ground around Aachen. Pierced the forward band of the Siegfried line along an 11-mile front and penetrated the heavier line of fortifications in 2 places. Now the closest enemy was delay. Every day, every hour of it, General Collins knew, must bring the Germans closer to their defenses. Since July, Hitler himself had taken personal charge of Germany's war. His strategy for the Western Front could now be summed up in 2 words: stand fast. And backing his edict with reinforcements, 15,000 men of the German 12th Infantry Division had reached the Rohr River the night of the 16th and were pouring into the defense positions of the Siegfried Line. They were waiting as the 7th Corps reconnaissance burst into a full-scale attack on the line's main fortifications, extending to the south into the gloom of a forest straight from the German folk tales of the Brothers Grimm, the stifling embrace of its densely interwoven trees obscuring the sky itself. The Rhine Forest, a name that would come to symbolize the long-drawn heartbreak and despair of war, as surely as its fairy tale counterparts had enshrined the nightmares of childhood. On the same day, Hitler's heavy reinforcements appeared to dispute the 7th Corps passage of the Siegfried Line. To the north, over the Netherlands, the whole sky blossomed with parachutes in the war's largest airborne assault. If the Allied Operation Market Garden had succeeded, the Siegfried Line would have been outflanked, ending the Rhine Forest nightmare almost as soon as it began. But the weather, combined with unexpectedly firm German resistance, to prevent the airborne troops from keeping the foothold over the Rhine that would have set the stage for the drive to Berlin. Again, there was no alternative. The Siegfried Line campaign would have to continue. From the deceptively open country and the villages to the north, down to the shadowy heart of the Rhine Forest itself, the foot soldiers of the 7th Corps carried their assaults. But for every yard advanced, the next came that much harder. The line had been penetrated, pillboxes captured and destroyed. But of the enemy, an enemy that had fled halfway across Europe and now suddenly turned to fight with a resistance as inexplicable as it was fierce. An enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. In the confusion and uncertain shadows of the thick trees, the only proofs were the prisoners and the dead laid out at peace on the forest floor. "19 days had passed since General Lightning Joe Collins had pierced the first dragon teeth of the Siegfried Line. But now, as September closed around his 7th Corps and those on either side of him, the entire First Army, for the first time since the breakout at the Normandy beachhead, was stopped. The author of the official Army history from which our narrative is drawn, Mr. Charles B. MacDonald, has been discussing this critical period of World War II with General J. Lawton Collins, retired Army Chief of Staff.
General Collins, the First Army's 7th Corps actually had broken through the Siegfried line before coming to a halt. But it was not only the fortifications that had stopped them. At that time, you were the 7th Corps commander. What was the situation?
Yes, after the breakthrough in Normandy in late July, we had the Germans on the run, and we wanted to keep them on the run. We didn't want to give them a chance to stop and organize themselves. But I had hoped to get through the Siegfried defenses before we had to stop. But just as we had crossed the German frontier, we began really to run out of gasoline and ammunition, and unfortunately, out of good weather. And the loss of the good weather caused our close support aviation practically to stop. And this was a real blow. Our men were still in good shape and were anxious to keep going, but they were tired. And even more important, our tanks began to need replacement and repairs. For example, the 3rd Armored Division, which had spearheaded our attack, normally had some 230-odd tanks. But when we hit the Siegfried defenses, only about 75 of them were fully operative. Now, you remember also that the Siegfried defenses east of Aachen were very powerful defenses. And from the high ground overlooking our positions, they were looking right down our throats. Now, an attacker, in order to break through, has to move. And when he does that, he gets out into the open, and then he becomes vulnerable to enemy fire.
The next step now was to build up supplies, bring up reinforcements, and reorganize in order to exploit your breakthrough with the new drive by the First Army to the Rhine River.
Yes, that's right. We had to do all of these things, but we still had unfinished business right where we were. In fact, there were 3 attacks that had to be launched. To the north of Aachen, the First Army had to get its 19th Corps through the Siegfried defenses, and then south of Aachen and the Rhine Forest, the 5th Corps, the right-wing corps of the First Army, had also to get forward. But in order for them to move, the 7th Corps in the center had to clear the Rhine Forest. These things were necessary in order that we could exploit the breakthrough that we'd already made through the first set of the Siegfried defenses. And then, in addition, we had Aachen, the city of Aachen, on our left. And while we dominated the high ground overlooking Aachen, we couldn't go past the city and leave a pocket of resistance there on our left rear. So therefore, the 7th Corps had to capture Aachen. Now, all of these things, these 3 attacks, had to be coordinated by General Courtney Hodges, the fine commander of the First Army, who, in my judgment, never has received proper public recognition for the great job that he did in leading the First Army all the way from our breakthrough in Normandy to our meeting with the Russians on the Elbe River.
Aachen, ancient capital of the Holy Roman Empire, was attacked on October 8th. For 13 days, this shrine to Germany's resplendent history was convulsed in the tumult of modern war. All the vain hopes of the 20th century crowded through streets that had witnessed the serenity of medieval culture and learning, and the coronation of 32 emperors and kings. To the Americans, the surrender of Aachen meant another concentration of enemy resistance wiped from their path. To the returning refugees, evacuated when the order had come for the city's last-ditch defense, in these crumbled ruins lay the still warm ashes of the myth of the Third Reich. Dating now not the 1,000 years into the future that Hitler had pledged it, but more than 1,000 years back, to the day when the city had given birth to Charlemagne, Emperor of the West. In terms of war, Aachen now belonged to the past. For the men of the 19th Corps north of Aachen, it was the same yard by yard, man by man struggle toward the Ruhr River and the Cologne plain that opened to the Rhine. But below Aachen, still lying athwart the entire south wing of General Hodge's First Army, the Remagen Forest remained uncleared. November came, and with it, the staggering assault delivered by the 28th Division of General Giraud's 5th Corps. But the merciless forest absorbed that wholesale tragic heroism and asked for more. Courage was no match for it, measured in any amount of men. It devoured them and asked for more. It had become a nightmare from which there was no awakening, even as a new enemy joined the old. The worsening weather was an enemy the men could come to grips with, but to almost as little avail. And like the old one, it seemed to become more tenacious as the days passed. The October attack had broken into a series of minor engagements when General Eisenhower determined upon the crushing new offensive that would sweep the entire Western Front. The 9th Army, under General William H. Simpson, was moved in north of Aachen. Day after day, the weather delayed its opening blow until at last, November 16th dawned upon the heaviest air bombardment in direct support of ground troops to be launched in all of World War II. With the British Second Army to the north, the American First and Ninth Armies were to drive for the Rhine. Again, the main effort would be made in the Aachen sector as the most direct route to the vital Ruhr industrial area, Germany's arsenal. And there again, it would be made by the 7th Corps. The onslaught did not miss its mark. By now, Germany's war losses in weapons and equipment were so enormous as to defy estimate. The summer months alone had taken over 1 million German casualties, and now new and uncounted numbers pressed the total to nearer 4 million since the war began. Yet they fought back. Their communications shattered, their supply lines smashed. They returned the attack with a ferocity that seemed whetted by their losses. This was no fairy tale. This was no myth. 10,000 tons of bombs had been dropped on the German defenses, but still the Germans replied. From the Alliance Supreme Command down to the exhausted GI, it had not even the fairy tale's horrifying logic. It was war. War demanding new men, new courage, and giving nothing in return, but those demands pressed harder. Hopes for the sweeping success of the great November offensive had been swallowed, just as the Ardennes Forest swallowed new reserves and asked for more. It was war that demanded casualties any way it could get them, and the winter became as vicious an enemy as any lurking behind the trees. In the Ardennes Forest, it was war where battle tactics lost their meaning, where gains were still measured in yards, in feet, in dead. Still, they were gains. And while battle strategies might founder, the inexorable rules of war would demand that either advance or retreat must eventually prevail. Even in the Ardennes Forest, one of those must prevail. It was advance. Beyond it, each unit, each man advanced on his own terms, trampling the bleak fragments of a myth that fled before every step he took forward, as though it had never existed. As though nothing but cold and mud had ever existed. Beyond the Ardennes Forest, war became human again, but that did not redeem it. And as though there were not already enough desolation and waste and sheer loss of everything to be valued, there was always another engagement, another pocket of desperation, defending what was already lost. And there was the cold, echoing in desolate wastes of roads and towns and people in ruin, the hollow entreaties of defeat. The dragon teeth, the barbed wire and hidden guns of the Siegfried line were behind, where the Ardennes Forest nightmare lay at last splintered and torn open to what winter sunlight there was. 3 months had passed since the first patrols had pierced that frontier, but even now, these two American armies were barely 22 miles inside Germany. The November offensive was 3 weeks old when the 9th Army reached the Roer River. Its swollen waters ready to flood the plain if either side had burst the dams hidden high in the Ardennes Forest. A week later, a long week of hard fighting, because no one could have named its end. The First Army broke through to the Roer River, and the plain opened out toward the Rhine, where hope lay that war, even this war, might end. The Siegfried Line campaign was a part of history, but was it a part, and perhaps, after all, the real part of war?
General Collins, the dash of long sweeping drives was conspicuously absent from this campaign, but that is what much of war is like, long periods of dogged, determined fighting.
Yes, that's correct. As a matter of fact, I think the chief of military history has put it very well in his foreword to your book when he says that huge armies waged the campaign described in this book, but the individual soldier, pitting his courage and stamina against harsh elements as well as a stubborn enemy, emerges as the moving spirit of these armies. As a matter of fact, no part of the fighting in Europe tested the American soldier quite like the Siegfried campaign did, and the fighting in the Rhine Forest. The American soldier there proved that he could take some pretty hard knocks and still slug it out.
And I might say that if this story lacks a smashing climax, this is because the historian, unlike the novelist, is never the master of his material. Ordinarily, of course, the campaign would have continued with a big push across the Ruhr River to the Rhine.
Yes, but as a matter of fact, while we were slugging it out in the Rhine Forest, Hitler was planning a major counteroffensive to the south of us that he hoped would end the war. And there, about 25 miles south of Aachen, he hit a very thinly held part of our line, made a breakthrough there, and it led into what became known as the Battle of the Bulge.
And this goes a long way toward explaining the fierce resistance put up by the Germans on the Ruhr Plain and in the Rhine Forest. Looking ahead to his counteroffensive, Hitler had ordered that no Allied soldier was to be allowed to set foot beyond the Ruhr River.
Yes, but fortunately, in the Battle of the Bulge, we used up all of the German reserves of men and material west of the Rhine River. And the attacks of the 1st and the 9th Armies through the Siegfried defenses prior to the Bulge had chewed up all the local reserves available. So that when we moved back north of the Bulge, to renew our attack across the Ruhr River and the Cologne Plain, things moved along very rapidly. And we soon had Cologne, as a matter of fact, within 2 weeks, and we were firmly on the Rhine, and thereby had guaranteed the ultimate success of our war in Europe.
Every major victory in war is a result of long planning, long preparation, with the loss of often thousands of men. But when something comes along that is unexpected and you have this great prize, now there's a great elan. In the other cases, you've expected it, you've planned for it, and here you come along with something that gives a great lift to the morale of the whole force, everybody. I think from private up to our bosses in Washington and London knew that the war was over. Every one of us realized that if Hitler had the slightest sense, he would immediately surrender. But it was the gallantry of the men that did it is something that should never be forgotten. And their names really ought to be in some, I'd say, permanent place in the niche of fame that the American government should like to keep.
People of Remagen love their bridge. They loved it because it was an attraction for visitors from all over the countryside. And they loved to stroll across it on Sunday afternoons, to have picnics near the site of it. And they're right proud of the fact that the bridge was a strategic link between the German Ruhr on the north and the Saar-Moselle region on the south. Everybody knew that it would take a long amount of planning to cross the Rhine River, because this was the big natural barrier between the Siegfried line and the straight shot toward Berlin. So even before we landed in Normandy, the Supreme Headquarters began to lay its strategic plans.
To explain the strategy for crossing the Rhine, a little background is necessary. Hitler still had, at that time, a very strong army and strong armed force west of the Rhine. And we counted on almost the certainty that he would not allow them to withdraw when they saw their situation to be hopeless, and take the bulk of their forces back across the Rhine, and therefore defend that very great obstacle in such a way that we would have a very terrible time to get across. So we began to plan the basic, or what you might say, the power crossing of the Rhine for a crossing just to the north of the Ruhr. This would be in the zone of the 21st Army Group under General Montgomery, and to that force I had attached the 9th Army under General Simpson to reinforce Montgomery's blow. And of course we gave him a considerable time to prepare for that, you might call formal or power crossing. In the meantime, however, we went about the business of destroying the German forces west of the Rhine, and this was a series of blows that had been taken up first in the way to the north, and into Bradley's Army Group, and finally down into the Army Group of Devers, which had both a French Army and an American Army in his command.
There was considerable argument as to how we should cross the Rhine when we reached the West Bank. The British argued, particularly Marshal Montgomery, that we should cross only in the north and make our attack north of the Ruhr toward Berlin. The maximum number of divisions you could supply on that narrow front was something like 25, but he wanted to take these divisions and let the rest of us stay on the West Bank in a defensive position. The Americans argued that that was no way to do it, that we should advance on a broad front so that the Germans could not concentrate against us on a narrow front. And with a broad front, we'd have better mobility and could probe and secure the places where they were weakest. So that my plan was to cross the First Army just south of the Ruhr, and the Third Army under Patton to cross down somewhere near Koblenz, and then join them together and attack to sweep around the south and east side of the Ruhr and connect up with the 9th U.S. Division, which at that time was under Monty, on the east side of the Ruhr, and then clean up the Ruhr. As a matter of fact, we did do that later and secured something like 368,000 prisoners in the Ruhr.
At the end of February 1945, the 9th Armored Division, having been re-equipped and received replacements, was moved up behind the First Army and attached or assigned to the 3rd Corps and crossed the Ruhr River north of the dams. We then moved out onto the Rhine plain, where we encountered small pockets of resistance, which was primarily that of the anti-aircraft defense guns, which had been lowered so that they could fire as anti-tank guns.
owing to the lack of cover and the very flat terrain, this was a very serious obstacle. But we were moving forward at the rate of 5 to 10 miles an hour.
One of the reasons that the Americans made such great progress toward the Rhine was the fact that Hitler insisted that every position be held to the last man. This meant that the Americans could bypass a good many of these strong points which the Germans had set up in the Rhineland. There was great confusion in the German defenses at Remagen on March 7, 1945. Captain Friesenhahn, the engineer commander, had been sent to Remagen in 1943 to assume command. He was replaced by Captain Brodke as the top commander, who came in 1944. These two commanders tried in vain to sort out the miscellaneous set of units that kept filtering through Remagen.
As the Americans approached Remagen in early March, I had at my disposal, in the bridgehead of Remagen, one sapper company of 125 men. The sappers were assigned to the planking of the railroad bridge in order to make it passable for motor vehicle traffic. The men had to work day and night in order to complete the bridge. Besides these men, the Bridge Defense Company was also under my command. It consisted of 35 men, convalescents, all of whom were still under treatment. Some of these men were not even able to manipulate a gun because, of course, they had stiff limbs.
The town of Remagen had some advantages for both the attacker and the defender. From the standpoint of the attacker, there was high ground going into the town where you could direct operations from. But it was very easy to defend Remagen because of the crooked and narrow streets, and particularly the 600-foot-high cliff on the opposite side of the Rhine, which provided wonderful observation for 10 miles around, from which the defender could see anybody approaching the town.
On the morning of March 7th, we received orders and were given maps covering the area leading to Remagen. We noticed on the map the bridge of the Ludendorff Bridge. No one paid any attention to this bridge on the map because we had received no orders pertaining to the bridge or the capture of the bridge. All we were told was that we would attack the town of Remagen, take it, and then swing south, trying to connect up with Patton's Third Army.
Progress was not too fast. It was just 10 miles to the Rhine, but it took considerable time to get there. We met up with some so-called light resistance, but I've always felt that a 30 caliber bullet aimed at the right spot is just as heavy resistance as an artillery shell if the man dies from it. Realizing that the Rhine was our mission, we looked forward with some anticipation, of course, of reaching this historical river. Some of us recognized that the Rhine itself had a great deal of impact on the outcome of the war, that it had to be crossed, but how it was to be done, we were not advised. And it was hoped that when we did reach the Rhine, that we would be given a break, being an armored outfit, that we would not be able to get across the Rhine until some type of bridging had been established.
Early in March of 1945, there was a whole series of new company commanders in Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, where Carl Timmerman served as a platoon leader. The advance along the Rhineland toward Remagen resulted in a number of casualties to the officers, and on the night of March the 6th, Carl Timmerman was tapped to be the next company commander of Company A. His orders were to capture the town of Remagen and then to stop. By the morning of the 7th of March, along about 11:30, Carl Timmerman saw a great deal of excitement up ahead on the edge of the woods. He gunned his Jeep, went to the edge of the woods, and looked down on the broad Rhine River. And there he saw the electrifying sight of a bridge still standing, the Ludendorff Bridge, a bridge which the Americans never expected to find standing.
Around 10:20 a.m., the entire front line of the American infantry had reached the edge of the Remagen bridgehead. Our bridge defense company opened fire with rifles and machine guns, upon which the American infantry forces retreated, and for the time being, everything remained quiet. About 11:15 a.m., a major in General Staff uniform arrived and introduced himself as Major Schurler. Major Schurler told me that he had orders to take over command at Remagen. At that moment, I breathed a sigh of relief, because I thought, now we will get the promised additional battalions. My first question was, where are the battalions? Major Schurler looked at me in surprise and asked, which battalions? Now it was my turn to look surprised, and I almost suspected that something was not quite in order.
When Timmerman first saw that the Remagen Bridge was still standing, his first reaction was, let's get some artillery down on that, because look at all those German vehicles and troops that are crossing. However, the order came back from higher headquarters, nothing except air bursts would be fired at that bridge, since it's still standing. Timmerman was then ordered by Colonel Engelmann, the task force commander, to make a reconnaissance down into Remagen, which he proceeded to do. The tanks and infantry then attacked the town. The infantry moved, hugging close to the walls of the buildings of the town, cleaned it out within 2 hours.
While the troops were moving into position for the attack on the bridge, we captured a number of soldiers, civilians, and some railroad people in uniform. The rumor came back to me that several of these reported that the bridge was to be blown up at 4 o'clock. I don't think there was any truth in that, but at the time, I informed the task force commander, Colonel Engelmann, that he should speed up his attack, since the bridge was supposed to be blown at 4 o'clock. It was then about 3:30.
Major Devers, the infantry battalion commander, asked Lieutenant Timmerman, you think you could get your company across that bridge? Timmerman said, well, we can try. Devers said, go ahead. Timmerman asked, what if the bridge blows up in my face? The battalion commander didn't answer, he just walked away. In fact, nobody ever answered the question, what if the bridge blows up in my face?
While these troops were taking their position on the west bank of the Rhine along the bridge, an explosion occurred in the causeway leading to the bridge. This threw up a great quantity of dirt and smoke, and afterwards I saw it, and it was about 30 feet in diameter and formed an obstacle to the crossing of vehicles. A powerful detonation occurred on the left bank of the Rhine, immediately behind the bridge. I did not know how to explain this. Captain Friesenhahn, the bridge commander, had blasted the dike on the other side of the bridge, at the ramp of the bridge, a demolition which had already been envisaged. This was a sign to me that the Americans were approaching.
But so far as the main demolitions were concerned, something very peculiar happened on the morning of the 7th of March. Friesenhahn and Brodke had ordered some reserve TNT in order to arm the explosives. When the truck came up on the morning of the 7th of March, Brodke and Friesenhahn were horrified to discover that they had gotten just about half as much explosives as they had been promised, and in addition to that, it was an industrial type of explosive known as liberate, instead of the military explosive, which was far more powerful.
Captain Friesenhahn was calling from the tunnel entrance. Captain Brodke, combat commander! I rushed over to him. Still completely out of breath, he reports to me, the Americans, they're at the Becher timber mill. This mill was located immediately behind the Rhine. In other words, they had reached the bridge. I told him, Friesenhahn, blast the bridge, blow it up. I have no permission. Major Schürler is the only one who can give the order for demolition. At that moment, Major Schürler was on the other side of the tunnel, 350 meters away from us, only to be reached on foot. So I dashed off through the dark tunnel to Major Schürler. I reported to him, the Americans are going to cross the bridge. Major Schürler is very calm. I said, Major, if you don't give orders to blast the bridge, I will do so. Then go ahead, have the bridge blasted. I ran back to Captain Friesenhahn. Back again through the dark tunnel. Again, minutes passed before I could reach him. As soon as he could hear me, I called out to him, Friesenhahn, blow up the bridge! Friesenhahn shouts, full cover, full cover! Everybody in the tunnel lies down flat on the ground in order to escape the tremendous blast we expected.
As far as we know, we actually saw the bridge lift up off its foundation. There was dust and debris thrown all over, and after a while, you couldn't see the bridge anymore. It wasn't too long. The dust cleared, the bridge was still standing. And Timmerman said, okay, move out.
Instinctively, my hand comes to my neck. I know. If the bridge doesn't go down into the water, my life will be at stake. Something has to happen. I rush back to Major Schürler and report to him. Demolition of the bridge has failed. But I had hardly reached him when someone called again through the tunnel, Captain Brodke, combat commander up front. It grows louder and louder. Major Schürler says, have a look what is going on. Again, I run back through the tunnel, through the masses of civilians, passing men, women, children. Soldiers are amongst them. I reach Friesenhahn. Friesenhahn already shouts, Americans across the bridge. That was all we needed. Come on, Friesenhahn. A few men from the sapper unit. Counterattack. There can be many of them. We have to throw them back. I've already tried it. We wanted to get out immediately. But look, the tremendous gunfire aimed at the entrance of the tunnel. One grenade after another. You can't subject anybody to that. No one will get out alive. Friesenhahn, there is only one possibility. Escape through the other end of the tunnel, across the dam, a counterattack. The Americans have to retreat. I rush back to Major Schürler. Report to him. Americans are crossing the bridge. Major, you have to prepare for an immediate counterattack. I will get the people out of the tunnel. Do you want to get them out? No, Brodke. You go ahead. I enter the tunnel. Get hold of a sergeant, summon everyone who still carries arms. Here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 9 men. Sergeant Fellner, run along, get me 9 men. Major Scheller still has 2 lieutenants with him. He should put them into action. In the meantime, I look for some more men. Sergeant Fellner leaves. I shout, get them together. I have 5 men now. Fellner comes back. Major Scheller isn't there. It's impossible, I think to myself. And I even barked at Sergeant Fellner in a rather irritated manner. Open your eyes! He is standing right there at the entrance to the tunnel. He is aggravated and replies, that isn't so. He's gone. What to do now? I accompany him to the entrance of the tunnel. Major Scheller is gone. He left the tunnel together with the 2 lieutenants in the direction of Funke. That was the last thing I could make out. Immediately, I make an announcement. I am taking over combat command at once. I run back to Friesenhahn. He will have to know what is going on. I tell him, Friesenhahn Scheller is gone. I don't know why he left. Now we have to get all the men who are still in here out of the tunnel, gather everyone near Ostberg, and launch a counterattack. There's no other alternative left. Friesenhahn agrees. Friesenhahn and I push all the men from the back to the front in order to evacuate the whole tunnel. The first soldiers leave the tunnel. Hand grenades burst right in front of them. Gunfire, machine gun fire hits the tunnel entrance. The Americans have crossed the mountain terrain. They have the tunnel exit. How that was possible, I still can't understand up to this day. How many times did I climb this mountain? What an effort it was. That was not only a good military achievement, but also a commendable physical accomplishment of our comrades on the other side.
Now, unknown to the German commander, Captain Brodke, on the afternoon of March 6th, the day before the Americans reached Remagen, this anti-aircraft unit was replaced and sent down to Koblenz. The unit that came in to take its place never did get up to the top of the hill on the 7th of March.
Since the bridge was standing, I directed the task force commander to move the infantry across the bridge. While watching their progress over the bridge, I received a radio message from the division stating that previous missions were canceled and that Combat Command B was to move south across the Aar River in the direction of Koblenz and join up with the units of the 3rd Army, which were moving north from that direction. I did not know exactly how to react to this, since we were in process of capturing a bridge over the Rhine, which I believe to be of considerable value to our forces. On the other hand, it was a direct violation of orders not to call off this attack and proceed to the south. There seemed to be one way of getting out of this dilemma, and that was for the bridge to fall. So I stood on the hill and watched the bridge until the infantry battalion had reached the far bank. My next thought was that I should get back and contact higher headquarters and tell them what the situation was, that I had disobeyed their orders, and receive confirmation for the action which I had taken.
When I received this phone call from Hodges, that was one of the best pieces of news we'd received for some time. It was a great satisfaction that we had been able to capture this bridge, and I expect I was somewhat excited about it. And as soon as I finished talking to Hodges, I called Eisenhower. He was very excited about it, and we both realized this is very fine news. It would save us the trouble and expense and casualties of making an assault crossing of the Rhine, and it really was one of the nicest things that happened to us during this period.
Well, I shouted with glee, of course, and I told Bradley, well, look, we were going to capture Cologne with an allotted 4 or 5 divisions to that, and Cologne surrendered. You've got those right handy. They are not allotted now to any other mission. Why not get them across? Well, he said, that is exactly my plan, but I just wanted to check in with you. And I said, all right, we agree. Get over there just fast as you can. And they did. This, I forget the name, the numerical designation of the corps, but they went over very rapidly.
I received the news that we had captured Remagen Bridge while I was sitting in my headquarters in Namur. At the time, General Bull from Schaeff headquarters was in my office, and I passed the news on to him, and we discussed the advantage of it. Of course, when Hodges, the First Army commander, phoned the message into me that we had received it, I told him to shove troops across and secure the bridgehead, taking whatever troops across were necessary, and so we could hold that bridgehead for future operations. This bridge enabled us to get across the Rhine here without having to make an assault later on, and really made a decision to cross on a wide front easier for Eisenhower to make.
When we received the orders that we would have to cross the bridge, the thing that struck me was the length of the bridge and the Erpelay on the other side of that bridge, which had very commanding ground for the German army to defend if they had the soldiers over there to defend it. As to my men, I believe I had the best men in the army and the best fighting platoon within the army at that time. We go to heaven for each other.
From our position on the west bank of the Rhine, we could see considerable enemy activity across the river in the little town of Erpel. A very pretty little town, but it was set on the side of a mountain or a cliff. It did not lend itself very well to an attack. If we should move into that area, the enemy would have quite an advantage overlooking our position. However, since we were there to cover the crossing of the infantry, we did pick out numerous targets of opportunity, as we call them, and opened fire and fired across the river to assist the infantry in crossing the bridge.
As we started across, the only thing that was in my mind was to get off that bridge. The Germans had attempted once to blow it and had failed. And we felt sure, or I felt sure, that the next time the bridge would go. Therefore, we tried to move as fast as we possibly could. However, the leading elements were being shot at by snipers and other people on the other side, and they were moving more cautiously. Then somebody yelled, "Who has the right tower?" I looked over my shoulder. I didn't see anybody move. So I moved over to the right tower. I pushed the door in, and there were 5 Germans huddled around a machine gun. Apparently the gun had jammed, and they were trying to unjam it. I fired a couple of shots, and I yelled, "Hand hoch," which in English means hands up. That was about the only German I knew. They spun around and threw their hands up in the air. I took the machine guns and I threw it out the aperture of the tower, showing the boys that the gun had been knocked out and they had nothing to fear from it. Then, in broken German, English, and whatever other language I could muster, I tried to make them understand and asked them if there was anyone upstairs. The one kept saying 9, 9. I didn't know what it meant at the time. Now I know it means no, but I didn't take their word for it. Using the 5 as a shield, we started to move up the steps to the 2nd floor of the tower. When we got up there, I found the lieutenant and an enlisted man. The lieutenant made a dive for the corner of the tower. I fired 2 shots in front of him. He stopped. I don't know what he was diving for. I never stopped to check. All I wanted to do, as I said, was to get off that bridge. I turned around and continued to the attack. Right in front of us, as you get off the bridge, there's the tunnel, the railroad tunnel. Sergeant Krebs and I advanced towards it, and then we each took a hand grenade and threw it into the tunnel. There was a curve in the tunnel, and we got down as far as the curve, and we heard a great many voices talking and yelling and everything else. We couldn't make out how many people or who they were. We didn't know whether it was German soldiers or whether they were German civilians. However, we couldn't take a chance, so we threw a couple more grenades and fired a couple more shots.
Captain Friesenhahn and I rushed to the tunnel exit, quickly grab a few sapples, and try for the 2nd time to make an escape from the tunnel. And again the hand grenades roar down from the tunnel. And at a distance of approximately 120 meters in front of us, a machine gun fires right into the tunnel. Suddenly there are screams coming from behind us. We turn around and go back. There are casualties among the civilians. A man, a child. A bullet wound in the stomach, a gunshot in the leg. The civilians are excited. They scream. They cling to the soldiers, grab them and take away their arms. They come to me. Combat commander, order a ceasefire. Stop it. Our women, our children. I too have a wife at home. What shall I do? An order is an order. This is the most difficult hour of my life. I decide to summon the officers. I cannot carry on. I tell them, according to the Führer's orders, if an officer is no longer in a position to continue combat, he will have to pass on command. And whoever takes over will continue combat. And every officer has to take orders from him, down to the lowest rank soldier. Gentlemen, I have an announcement. Which one of you is willing to carry on the battle? I see silence. No one volunteers. Gentlemen, in that case, I'm obliged to pass on the command to the unit. Then I happened to look toward the tunnel exit. Civilians have hoisted the white flag, and they're leaving the tunnel together with the soldiers. It is impossible to go on fighting now. Gentlemen, the white flag has been hoisted without our consent. We are still subject to the regulations of the Geneva Convention. If we continue to fight, we will give the enemy the right to demolish everything. And all these women and children, we will be morally responsible for them. I therefore order a ceasefire. Destroy your weapons, and we will be the last ones to leave the tunnel. Meanwhile, the majority of civilians has left the tunnel, together with the soldiers. We 5 officers who are still in the tunnel, we are now leaving the tunnel too. The last ones to go are Captain Friesenhahn and I. We became prisoners of war of the Americans.
During the afternoon, we spent considerable time in adjusting our guns and making notes where various targets were, so in the event that we had to fire during the night, we would have those targets zeroed in. However, when nighttime came, I was called into a meeting of the officers by our combat commander to be briefed on what our next action would be. I was told at that time that we were going to attempt a crossing of the bridge with our tanks. It was not known if the strength of the bridge was sufficient to hold a tank, but the infantry needed armored support on the other side, and we had to make an effort to get our tanks over there. So we all started across, one close behind the other. As a matter of fact, I was so close to the tank in front of me that several times before the crossing was over, I had bumped Speedy Goodson's tank. I had called ahead to him because it was so dark, asking him to make sure that he did not get too far away from me. And he says, "Lieutenant, I can't very well get far away from you with you bumping me constantly." Except for the indecision or inability to follow this tape across the bridge, we did get across without any incident.
The Americans got 5 tanks and about 120 infantrymen across the Remagen Bridge, a pretty thin force to hold a strategic point like that. But the next morning, all of the American troops within miles around converged on the bridgehead, and within 24 hours, 8,000 American soldiers had crossed the Remagen Bridge.
We established a CP just across from the bridge on the east side, just north of the bridge, about 200 yards. This CP was in what had been the burgomaster's house at Erpel. The sign was still on the gate post. There was hole through the upstairs where several shells had passed through, and we moved into the basement where we found a supply of wine and beef, which we used while we were living in that place. My only souvenir of this attack is the sign which was taken off of the gatepost of the burgomaster's house. This was the first command post of the Allied forces on the east bank of the Rhine. It was from this command post in the cellar of the burgomaster's house at Erpel
that we commanded the development of the initial bridgehead across the Rhine River. Beginning that morning and continuing for a number of days later, there was a constant stream of American troops from the west bank to the east bank of the river.
As soon as we could, we threw 4 divisions across on the east side of the Rhine to form a bridgehead. The Germans countered by throwing 11 German divisions against us to try to push us back or at least contain us. Fortunately for us, those were divisions that had been fighting in the Bulge and the Ardennes and were very much reduced in strength and effectiveness. One of the divisions, for example, they threw against us was the 2nd Panzer Division, which had been badly chewed up and suffered terrific casualties. Another was the 5th Airborne German Division, which had also suffered terrific casualties. So with even 11 divisions thrown against our 4, they were not able to drive us back across the river. In fact, we could expand almost at will against them, and we gave orders to the 1st Division, to the 1st Army, to have those divisions expand, advance about 1,000 yards a day so that they would not be mined in and therefore would be able to break out when the time came.
The capture of the Remagen Bridge was of the utmost significance to the future operations, as from the beginning our plans had called for the complete isolation and capture of the Ruhr so as to deprive Germany of that great arsenal manufacture. Well, now, by getting across to the south of the Ruhr at Remagen and then waiting for the big push to the north of the Ruhr, we made it possible to surround the whole area much more rapidly and much more securely than had we attacked only at one place.
Hitler was hopping mad when the news of Remagen reached Berlin. He immediately demanded the heads of those who had been responsible for this treason. He set up a drumhead court-martial headed by a confirmed Nazi, General Hübner. The court-martial left Berlin on the 10th of March, 3 days after Remagen was captured. It included 3 officers, none of whom had any training in military justice. They allowed no defense counsel for the accused. 3 majors and 1 lieutenant were dragged before the court-martial, harangued, and sentenced within an hour. They were taken out the next morning into a small wood about 25 miles from the Rhine River, shot by a firing squad in the back of their heads, buried in 10 inches of soil. This was Hitler's quick answer to the capture of Remagen Bridge. Hitler threw in everything he had in an effort to destroy the Remagen Bridge. He fired the deadly V2s against the bridge. He mobilized a couple of big 17-centimeter railroad guns to fire in their big charges. Most of all, he thought he could destroy the bridge through underwater swimmers. There was a special group of swimmers that had been trained in Vienna, all under 29 years of age, in perfect physical condition. They went into the water several miles above the bridge and swam underneath water, armed with charges that they were going to put against the bridge. However, they were picked up by real powerful American searchlights mounted on tanks that were sweeping the river during the night. These swimmers never did reach their objective, and they were captured by the Americans a mile or so below the bridge.
With reference to the traffic across the bridge, as you can well understand, there was only the one bridge to start with. Engineers were brought forward immediately and started the construction of ferries and then bridges
across the river. Initially, almost all of the traffic was from west to east. The only time we reversed the traffic was to take back the wounded. Later, when ferries were in operation and the pontoon bridges came into use, the traffic was both ways and the bridge was closed for repairs.
For a period of about 7 days, my unit, the Combat Engineer Battalion, worked hand in hand with a bridge construction outfit that was more or less in charge of erecting the dismembered pieces of iron and steel that were the upper part of the bridge. Ours was mainly the job of the flooring of the bridge. This was a railroad bridge, by the way. And we worked feverishly around the clock, 24 hours a day in different shifts, to build a Bailey Bridge, to get treadway on the bridge so that we could give the boys some support or get some equipment to them that were fighting so hard on the other side of the river. During this time, there was constantly periods where enemy aircraft was coming in, strafing the bridge, dropping bombs, trying to knock this bridge out. There was artillery fire. We stopped periodically to get under cover for these. One time, I remember, rather stupid of me, enemy aircraft came over, and as it did, I tried to find something to hide under, and it was the Bailey Bridge that we were constructing. And after the strafing was over, I realized that this is probably the worst place that I could have been, because if that bridge had been hit, I'd have been caught or trapped underneath there. But these are the things that you remember afterwards, at any rate. This was a constant turmoil. It was men racing against time, that we needed help for those fellows over there, and we were working real hard, equipment flying all over the place. In addition to our job as engineers on this bridge, the 276 also took its part in the security measures. That is, that we had places of observation at the bridgehead that we could maybe counter an attack that might be made on the bridge. At any rate, about 3:30 in the afternoon, I'd say, my unit, that is my company, was taking over the security of this bridge from another unit, also in our battalion. And at 3:30, I was up on the bridge along with, I think, a Lieutenant Enos, and we were comparing where the vantage points were for these guards. And at 3:45 or some such time, we walked toward the western bank of the river, where I had my men stationed in a truck, and we had just about decided that these were good places to have the people. And mind you, at this time, the railroad engineers were still working, and we also had a deadline of about 5 o'clock that evening that the bridge for the first time was going to be opened up to the heavy equipment traffic. And everybody was working feverishly to get this job done for that particular time. At any rate, about 3:45, Lieutenant Enos and I were down at the bridgehead, or at the western bank, and we were discussing a few little details, and he was pulling some of his men off, and I was just getting ready to send mine up, when suddenly we heard something like rifle fire. And we looked up in the air as if to look for aircraft, but instead there was dust coming up, rising from the bridge, and it seemed to totter a little, and it seemed to sway toward us. And then the center section of the bridge started to cave in. We had trucks up on the bridge that part of it was on the center section and part on the abutment side, so that this truck, I can remember, just folded up like an envelope. Pieces of equipment and pieces of the bridge were tumbling down. And I think our first reaction was to take cover that either the bridge had been hit or for some reason that it was going to fall. And then just as rapidly as you can well imagine, that whole big structure disappeared in front of us. And now we're all running to see what we can do about fishing people out of the river. That it was almost a bubbling, roaring noise, that it almost seemed like the river itself had been turned into a boiling pot with all this debris falling in and men screaming, and you could see fellows were hurt and grasping for something to hang on to and going down the river, where eventually they were picked up. But ours was a case of real turmoil then.
Lots of reasons contributed to the collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge on the 17th of March. In the first place, the German demolition on the 7th of March had really shattered one side of the bridge and weakened it seriously. Then when the Americans put planking on the bridge to cover it over and cover over the holes which had been blown in the bridge, this added about 50 tons of weight to the bridge. There was a great deal of heavy pounding from the tanks and the vehicles that crossed. The German artillery shells tore a lot of additional holes in the bridge. Then there were the bombs that the Luftwaffe dropped on the bridge itself. One of the real reasons, I think, in addition to this, that contributed to the collapse was the amount of heavy equipment that the engineers moved onto the bridge. Cranes, electric arc welders, air compressors, all these things set up vibrations. The American artillery batteries, and particularly anti-aircraft batteries that set up vibrations that caused all the ground to shake around the bridge. I don't think that you could say that any single one of these factors caused the collapse of the bridge, but the combination of them caused the structure just to weaken and die on the 17th of March.
The action of the people actually at the scene of the capture was beyond praise. Every man in the whole command approaching that bridge knew that it was mine. They knew that all the other bridges that they had seen were blown down into the water at that moment. And actually, of course, the Ludendorff Bridge was mine. Yet without a moment's hesitation, the local commanders, the platoon, company, and battalion commanders, and indeed I think General Hogue, who had the entire combat team, hesitated not a second. They rushed the bridge, went across, and there was an attempt to blow it up while they were on it, but there was a faulty fuse or something else of the kind, and that foiled that. But the attack had been so sudden and so unexpected on the part of the Germans that the thing just was a complete success. We had losses, true, but they were minor as compared to the great prize that we won.
So much has been said and written about Remagen. It was said that the bridge fell into the hands of the Americans through treason, sabotage, and cowardice. I guarantee that what I told you is true. Neither sabotage nor treason were involved. The bridge was lost to the Americans. The officers tried, and the German soldiers tried, up to the very last moment to do their duty. Even if it was a battle of unequal weapons, and we did not have at our disposal what we needed. We did what we could. And you American soldiers who perhaps see this film would not consider it an honor to know that the bridge of Remagen fell into your hands through treason. Your comrades of the past, Miller, Adelizio, and others, fought for the bridge, and there was bloodshed. Remember, the Americans conquered the bridge in rage.
Well, to us at the time, it was just another job. It was an objective that had to be taken, and we went ahead and took it to the best of our ability. No one, I don't believe, thought it was of great significance at the time. At least, we'll say at our level anyway. Maybe the higher-ups figured it had importance, but to us, it was just a job that had to be done, and we done it.
Captain Karl Friesenhahn, when I interviewed him right after the war, asked what awards the first Americans had received for crossing the bridge. And when I told him they had received Distinguished Service Crosses, he responded, they deserved them and then some. They saw us trying to blow up that bridge, and by all odds, it should have been blown up while they were crossing it. In my mind, they were the greatest heroes in the whole war.